The gray pre-dawn light of June 6, 1944, was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the choppy waters of the English Channel in muted shades of slate and steel. On the coast of Normandy, within the cold concrete confines of the Chris-Speck battery, Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen scanned the sea. The weather was poor, the visibility limited, conditions that had lulled the German High Command into a dangerous sense of security. For weeks, the entire German 15th and 7th Armies had been on high alert, anticipating the long-awaited Allied invasion, the invasion as it was simply known. But the storms of the past few days had convinced many that no sane commander would launch an amphibious assault in such seas. The alert level had been relaxed. Many senior officers were away from their posts, attending war games in Rennes or celebrating birthdays. For the men stationed along the Atlantic Wall, it was just another damp, miserable morning. But at 5 o'clock, something broke the monotony of the rolling waves. Ohmsen squinted, his eyes straining against the gloom. A shape, a ghostly silhouette, large and unfamiliar, emerged from the mist. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the entire horizon began to fill with them. It was not a reconnaissance force. It was not a raiding party. It was a fleet so vast it defied comprehension. A floating city of steel stretching from one end of the visible world to the other. His heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed his field telephone, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and terror, and reported what he was seeing. He did not know the exact number then, but he was looking at the vanguard of nearly 7,000 vessels. He was looking at the end of his world. As we delve deeper into this incredible story of a war decided not just by soldiers, but by factories and logistics, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss what unfolds next. Ohmsen's report, and others like it that began trickling in from stunned coastal observers, was met with a wall of skepticism and bureaucratic inertia. The German command structure, so efficient in theory, was paralyzed by disbelief. In the headquarters of the 709th Infantry Division, the initial reports were dismissed as a possible diversion, a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the Pas de Calais, the coastal region closest to England, which High Command was certain would be the true target. The Allies, with their elaborate deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude, had masterfully conditioned the German leadership to expect the main blow there. They had created a phantom army under General George S. Patton, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and double agents feeding false intelligence. The ruse was so successful that even as American, British, and Canadian soldiers were storming the beaches of Normandy, the most powerful German panzer divisions were held in reserve, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The man in charge of the coastal defenses, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was not even in France. Convinced the poor weather made a landing impossible, he had gone home to Germany to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday. His absence on this most critical of days created a power vacuum. The authority to release the panzer reserves rested with Berlin, with Adolf Hitler himself, who was asleep when the first reports came in, and whose aides were famously reluctant to wake him. This fatal delay gave the Allies the one thing they needed most: time. Time to get ashore. Time to consolidate their beachheads, and time to start pouring men and material onto French soil. For the soldiers in the bunkers, however, strategic confusion was a distant concern. They were confronted with a visceral, immediate reality. At the gun battery at Lons-sur-Mer, sailors of the Kriegsmarine watched as the Allied naval bombardment began. The world dissolved into a deafening chaos of sound and fury. Shells from battleships like the USS Arkansas and HMS Ajax, weighing as much as a small car, screamed overhead and slammed into the concrete fortifications. The ground shook violently, throwing men from their feet and filling the air with dust and the smell of cordite. For these defenders, the abstract concept of Allied industrial might became terrifyingly real. They were not just being attacked. They were being systematically dismantled by a force that could stand offshore beyond the range of their own guns and pound their positions into rubble with impunity. This overwhelming power was the product of a strategic decision made years earlier. The leaders of the Allied nations, particularly the United States, understood that the Second World War would be a total war, a contest of entire national economies. While German propaganda, masterfully crafted by Joseph Goebbels, portrayed America as a decadent, racially mixed and materialistic society incapable of producing hardened warriors, the reality was starkly different. America's supposed weakness, its consumer-driven industrial base, was, in fact, its greatest strength. The same factories that had churned out automobiles, refrigerators, and radios were converted, with breathtaking speed and efficiency, into the most formidable arsenal the world had ever seen. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, by contrast, managed just under 40,000, and a significant portion of these were defensive fighters desperately trying to fend off the Allied strategic bombing campaign that was crippling its own industry. The numbers for ground vehicles were even more lopsided. The U.S. produced over 650,000 trucks in 1944. These were not glamorous weapons, but they were the lifeblood of a modern army, allowing for the rapid movement of troops, fuel, ammunition, and food. The German army, by contrast, still relied heavily on horses to pull its artillery and supply wagons, a 19th-century logistical tale attached to a 20th-century fighting force. This disparity was now on full display on the Normandy coast. The sheer number of landing craft, over 4,000 of them hitting the beaches in successive waves, spoke to a level of mass production that German war planners had simply failed to grasp. From his position at the Crisbeck battery, Walter Olmsen and his men did what they were trained to do. They fought. Their heavy 210mm guns, originally designed for naval use, opened fire on the Allied fleet. They engaged the American cruiser USS Tuscaloosa and scored hits on the destroyer USS Corey, which later sank after striking a mine while maneuvering. For a few hours, the men of the Crisbeck battery were soldiers fighting a battle. But, as the day wore on, the futility of their situation became crushingly apparent. They were a single, isolated strong point against an entire ocean of enemies. Allied aircraft, the dreaded U-boats or fighter bombers, swarmed the skies with near total impunity. With the Luftwaffe almost entirely absent, they circled like birds of prey, strafing any sign of movement, bombing gun positions, and cutting communication lines. For the German soldier on the ground, the sky itself had become hostile territory. This feeling of being utterly overwhelmed was shared all along the 50-mile stretch of the invasion front. On a bluff overlooking a sector of the coast, the Allies had code-named Omaha Beach. a young German soldier named Heinrich Severloh manned his MG-42 machine gun. Stationed in a fortified position known as Widerstandsnest 62, he had a clear field of fire over the beach. As the ramps of the first American landing craft dropped, he opened fire. The MG-42, with its terrifyingly high rate of fire of up to 1,500 rounds per minute, was a devastatingly effective weapon. For hours, Severloh and his comrades poured a relentless stream of fire onto the American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. But for every soldier that fell, more seemed to come. The waves of landing craft were endless. When his machine gun barrel overheated, he would swap it for a spare. When he ran out of ammunition belts, another soldier would bring him more. He fired over 12,000 rounds from his machine gun and hundreds more from his rifle that day. Yet the Americans kept coming. They were a tide of men, an inexhaustible resource that his machine gun could slow but never stop. He was not fighting a platoon or a company. He was fighting the demographic and industrial output of the United States of America. He was watching a war of attrition where the other side had seemingly infinite reserves of everything, especially human lives. This brutal calculus, so clear to the man behind the machine gun, was the fundamental truth of D-Day. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. The German army had built its reputation on a doctrine of rapid, decisive warfare, the Blitzkrieg. It relied on superior training, tactical innovation, and the fighting spirit of its soldiers to achieve victory against numerically superior foes in Poland, France, and the early stages of the war in the Soviet Union. But on the beaches of Normandy, tactical skill and individual bravery were rendered almost irrelevant in the face of such colossal material superiority. A German veteran of the Eastern Front, upon being transferred to Normandy, was reportedly shocked by the difference. On the Eastern Front, he said, the greatest danger came from the enemy soldier. In Normandy, the greatest danger came from the enemy's material. You could be a veteran of 100 battles, a master of fieldcraft and tactics, and be erased from existence by a random artillery shell fired from a ship you could not even see. This new kind of warfare induced a sense of profound helplessness. The reports sent back from the front lines by German commanders are filled with a tone of desperation and astonishment. They requested air support that never came. They requested reinforcements that were tied up, waiting for the real invasion at Calais. They requested permission to launch counterattacks, only to have their panzer formations decimated by Allied fighter bombers before they could even reach the front. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the Hawker Typhoon, armed with rockets and cannons, became the masters of the Norman countryside, turning roads and bridges into killing grounds for any German vehicle that dared to move during the day. The story of the 21st Panzer Division on D-Day is a case in point. It was the only German armored division positioned close enough to the landing beaches to intervene on the first day. Commanded by General Edgar Fürchtinger, its tanks and armored infantry could have, in theory, driven a powerful wedge between the British and Canadian beachheads, and potentially thrown the invaders back into the sea. But its path to the coast was a nightmare. Harassed relentlessly from the air, its columns were broken up, delayed, and suffered significant losses before they even saw the enemy. When a portion of the division finally reached the coast near Lyon-sur-Mer in the late afternoon, they were met not only by determined British infantry and anti-tank guns, but also by the crushing firepower of the Allied naval fleet lying just offshore. The panzers, designed for mobile warfare on open plains, were now facing the main guns of battleships. It was a contest they could not win. By nightfall, the division's counterattack had failed, and the Allies had secured their foothold. This failure was a microcosm of the entire German predicament in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, which had been the centerpiece of German propaganda for years, was revealed to be a brittle shell. It was a concept conceived by a continental power that had never truly understood modern naval and air power. The wall was immensely strong where it was completed, with its steel-reinforced concrete bunkers and formidable artillery pieces. But it was a thin crust. It had no depth. Once the Allies breached it, there was very little behind it. The German strategy had relied on defeating the invasion at the water's edge. When that failed, there was no Plan B. The conflict in strategic vision between the two most senior German commanders in the West, Field Marshals Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, now proved catastrophic. Von Rundstedt, the aristocratic and experienced commander-in-chief West, believed in a classic military doctrine. He argued that it was impossible to defend every mile of coastline. He wanted to hold the bulk of the panzer divisions in a central reserve, far from the coast, and wait for the Allies to make their main landing. Once the enemy's objective was clear, he would unleash this powerful armored force in a decisive counterstroke to annihilate the beachhead. Rommel, who had experienced the overwhelming might of Allied air power firsthand in North Africa, vehemently disagreed. He argued that if the Allies were allowed to establish a secure beachhead, it would be impossible to dislodge them. Their air power would prevent any large-scale movement of German reserves during the day. The only chance, he insisted, was to defeat the enemy on the beaches. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. He wanted the panzer divisions positioned as close to the coast as possible, ready to strike the moment the first Allied soldier set foot on the sand. The result was a disastrous compromise. Some panzer divisions were placed under Rommel's command near the coast, while others were kept in the central reserve controlled by high command. This division of authority, coupled with the absence of key leaders and the success of the Allied deception plan, meant that on June 6th, the German response was slow, piecemeal, and uncoordinated. The one weapon that might have turned the tide, a swift, concentrated armored counterattack, never materialized. For men like Walter Ohmsen, trapped in their coastal batteries, the strategic debates were academic. Their war had become a simple and brutal struggle for survival. The Crisbeck battery, having fought valiantly throughout the day, found itself surrounded by American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, who had landed behind them during the night. The fight for the battery became a desperate close-quarters affair. The German gunners, trained for naval combat, were now fighting as infantry. They were isolated, cut off from communication, and running low on ammunition and medical supplies. This was the story repeating itself all across the Normandy front. Small, isolated pockets of German resistance fought on, often with incredible tenacity, but they were fighting a losing battle against a foe that could absorb staggering losses and continue to press forward. The sight that had greeted Ohmsen at dawn was not just an invasion fleet. It was the physical manifestation of a new paradigm of warfare. It was a war of logistics, of production, of overwhelming and relentless material force. The German officers and soldiers watching from their bunkers and trenches were among the first to witness this new reality. They saw that the courage and skill of the individual soldier, the traditional virtues of the German military, were being crushed under the sheer weight of steel produced in factories thousands of miles away. The psychological shock of that realization on that gray June morning was as devastating as any naval shell. They were not just fighting armies, they were fighting entire industrial systems. And it was a fight they could not possibly win. As the sun set on June 6th, the initial shock on the German side began to curdle into a grim understanding of their predicament. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The invaders were ashore, and despite suffering horrendous casualties on Omaha Beach, they were not going to be pushed back into the sea. For the German High Command, the first 24 hours had been a cascade of failures rooted in a lethal combination of strategic miscalculation, rigid command structure, and the overwhelming success of Allied deception. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, upon finally grasping the scale of the Normandy landings, had telephoned Berlin in a state of agitation. When asked by Field Marshal Keitel, the chief of Hitler's high command, "What shall we do?" von Rundstedt's exasperated and now famous reply was, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" It was a moment of brutal honesty from a man who saw the strategic equation with cold, clear eyes. The war was lost. The only question was how long it would take for the end to come. But peace was not an option. Hitler, insulated from reality in his Bavarian retreat, ordered that the beachhead be annihilated. He demanded fanatical resistance and issued strict no-retreat orders, a policy that had already led to the destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad and would prove equally catastrophic in France. For the German soldiers and their commanders in Normandy, the days and weeks that followed D-Day descended into a kind of hell that was unique in the annals of modern warfare. It became known as the Battle of the Hedgerows, or the Bocage. The Norman countryside, away from the sandy beaches, is a patchwork of small fields and sunken lanes enclosed by ancient formidable earthen walls, often 10 feet high and topped with dense, tangled hedges and trees. This terrain, almost impassable for tanks, was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. Here, in the claustrophobic green labyrinth of the Bocage, the German soldiers' defensive prowess came to the fore. A single machine gun team, a well-sighted anti-tank gun, or a handful of determined infantrymen with Panzerfausts could hold up an entire American or British battalion for hours, sometimes days. The fighting was intimate, brutal, and terrifyingly close. An enemy soldier could be unseen just a few feet away, on the other side of a hedge. Every field was a potential ambush. Every crossroads a pre-sighted killing zone for German mortars and artillery. The technological superiority of the Allies seemed, for a time, to be negated by the terrain. Tanks were vulnerable. Air power was less effective when targets were so well concealed. And artillery often just churned up more earth without dislodging the defenders. In this environment, the German army inflicted casualties on the Allies at a horrific rate. Experienced units, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, used their skill and cunning to maximum effect. They turned the Bocage into a meat grinder. But this tactical success masked a deeper strategic failure. The Germans were winning battles, but losing the war of attrition. For every tank they knocked out, the Allies could bring in 10 more. For every soldier they killed, a replacement was already on a ship crossing the Channel. The German forces, however, had no such luxury. Their losses were, for the most part, irreplaceable. Every veteran soldier, every tank, every artillery piece lost was a blow from which they could not recover. The German command was acutely aware of this grim arithmetic. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote despairingly of the situation. He described how any German troop movement during the day was suicide. The Allied Jabos, the fighter-bombers, ruled the skies. They strafed columns, blew up bridges, and hunted individual vehicles with ruthless efficiency. The German supply system, already strained, began to break down completely. Fuel, ammunition, and even food could only be brought to the front in small quantities, at night on roads that were constantly being bombed. The mighty panzer divisions, Germany's key offensive weapon, were immobilized for lack of fuel, forced to fight as static defensive pillboxes until they were destroyed one by one. Rommel himself toured the front lines and was aghast at what he saw. The man who had once been the master of mobile warfare in the deserts of North Africa was now forced to preside over a static, bleeding defense. He saw the hopelessness of the situation with a clarity that eluded those in the distant headquarters in East Prussia. In a stark report to Hitler dated July 15th, he laid out the unvarnished truth. The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. It is necessary, in my opinion, to draw the proper conclusions from this situation. I must speak plainly. The enemy is overwhelming us with his material superiority. The response from Berlin was silence, followed by accusations of defeatism. The contrast with the Allied situation could not have been more dramatic. While German logistics were collapsing, the Allies were performing a logistical miracle. They had brought their own ports with them. The two massive artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry, were assembled off the coast. These marvels of engineering, consisting of sunken concrete caissons and floating piers, allowed the Allies to unload thousands of tons of supplies every day, bypassing the need to capture a major port city like Cherbourg immediately. By the end of June, over 1 million men, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies had been landed on the Normandy beaches. The German officers who witnessed this endless river of men and material flowing onto the continent were stunned. Admiral Friedrich Ruge, Rommel's naval advisor, noted that the Allies were not just landing an army, they were landing entire nations. The psychological toll on the German soldier was immense. He was perpetually outnumbered, outgunned, and exposed. He lived in a constant state of fear, not just of the enemy in front of him, but of the unseen enemy in the sky. The omnipresent drone of Allied aircraft engines became the soundtrack to his existence. He saw the vast material wealth of his enemies firsthand. The sheer number of their trucks, the quality of their rations, the seemingly endless supply of artillery shells they could fire. German propaganda had told him that America was a soft, decadent nation. But the soldiers he was fighting were tough and determined, and they were backed by a productive power that beggared belief. The carefully constructed Nazi worldview began to crumble in the face of this overwhelming reality. The battle for key objectives, like the city of Caen, became a brutal testament to this new form of warfare. The British and Canadians had expected to take Caen on D-Day itself. Instead, it took them over a month of savage attritional fighting. The city was defended by some of the most formidable units in the German army, including the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a formation composed of young, fanatically devoted soldiers. They fought with a ferocity that shocked their opponents, but their bravery was ultimately futile. The Allies responded not by outmaneuvering them, but by obliterating them. They used their air force as flying artillery. In one instance, over 450 heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of bombs on the German positions in and around Caen, literally liquidating entire defensive lines and turning the ancient city into a moonscape of rubble. A German soldier who survived such a bombing described it as being at the epicenter of an earthquake, a feeling of utter powerlessness, as the world was torn apart around him. By late July, the German army in Normandy was a shadow of its former self. It had suffered over 100,000 casualties and lost the bulk of its armor. The relentless fighting had bled it white. It was at this moment that the Americans launched Operation Cobra. On July 25th, after a contentious and tragic preliminary bombardment by thousands of Allied aircraft that also caused significant American casualties, the U.S. First Army under General Omar Bradley smashed through the thinly held German lines west of St. Lo. The German front, stretched to the breaking point for weeks, did not bend. It shattered. The elite Panzer Lehr Division, which bore the brunt of the aerial bombardment, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in a matter of hours. What followed was the breakout. American armored columns, led by the flamboyant General George S. Patton's Third Army, poured through the gap and fanned out across the French countryside. For the first time since the landings, the war became one of movement. But this was not the blitzkrieg of 1940. This was an American-style blitzkrieg, fueled by an inexhaustible supply of gasoline and backed by total air supremacy. German resistance, where it existed, was bypassed and isolated. The strategic situation for the Germans in Normandy had gone from critical to catastrophic. Hitler, however, saw the American breakout not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. He saw Patton's armored columns with their exposed southern flank as a target. He ordered the last remaining German armored reserves to be gathered for a desperate counterattack at a town called Mortain, aiming to cut off the American spearheads and drive a wedge to the sea at Avranches. His generals on the ground, including Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt, knew it was a suicidal gamble. They pleaded for permission to withdraw their forces behind the Seine River to establish a new, more defensible line. Their pleas were ignored. The attack was to proceed. The Mortain counterattack, codenamed Operation Lüttich, was a disaster. Launched on August 7th, it ran directly into the teeth of Allied air power. The German panzer columns were spotted almost immediately and mercilessly attacked by rocket-firing Typhoon and Thunderbolt fighter bombers. The attack stalled, with heavy losses. But the true catastrophe was not just the failure of the attack itself. It was where it left the German armies. By concentrating their last armored forces for the westward thrust at Mortain, they had pushed themselves deeper into a trap. The Americans were sweeping around their southern flank, and the British and Canadians were pressing down from the north. The entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were in danger of being encircled. The space between the advancing Allied pincers around the town of Falaise began to shrink with terrifying speed. The German High Command was paralyzed by indecision and Hitler's refusal to countenance a retreat. For days, von Kluge tried desperately to get the order to withdraw, even driving to the front himself and disappearing for hours, sparking fears in Berlin that he was trying to surrender to the Allies. By the time the withdrawal order was finally given, it was too late. The escape gap had narrowed to only a few miles. What formed inside this shrinking perimeter, which became known as the Falaise Pocket, was one of the most horrific killing grounds of the entire war. Nearly 100,000 German soldiers, along with thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and horse-drawn wagons, were trapped. They were subjected to a continuous, round-the-clock bombardment from Allied artillery and aircraft. The roads were clogged with a chaotic jumble of retreating units, creating perfect targets. Allied pilots described flying over the pocket as if it were a training exercise with no target they could possibly miss. For the men trapped inside, it was an apocalypse. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. The sky was a constant menace, the ground a churned-up hell of craters and burning wreckage. There was no front line, no safety, no escape from the relentless rain of high explosives. A German army chaplain who survived the pocket later described the scene. The road was a river of blood and destruction. Dead men and dead horses, shattered wagons, and burning tanks were piled high. The living stumbled over the dead, their faces masks of exhaustion and terror. The cries of the wounded were everywhere. It was not a battle. It was a systematic industrial-scale annihilation. Desperate attempts were made to break out of the encirclement. Small groups of soldiers, abandoning their heavy equipment, tried to filter through the Allied lines at night. Some succeeded, but most did not. By August 21st, the pocket was finally sealed. The Battle of Normandy was over. The German army in the West had suffered a defeat more decisive and destructive than Stalingrad. In the space of less than 3 months, they had lost nearly 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Over 2,000 tanks and thousands of artillery pieces were gone. The entire Western Front had collapsed, and the road to Paris was wide open. The German officers who had witnessed the full arc of the campaign, from Walter Ohmsen's first sighting of the fleet on June 6th to the inferno of Falaise, were forever changed. They had begun the battle as professional soldiers, confident in their training and the traditions of the German military. They ended it as survivors of an industrial cataclysm. They had learned the ultimate lesson of modern total war, that courage, while noble, was no match for a 9-ton bomb. Tactical skill, while important, could not overcome a 10-to-1 disadvantage in tanks and aircraft. They had not been defeated by the American, British, or Canadian soldier. They had been defeated by the American factory, the British shipyard, and the Canadian grain field, all harnessed into a single, unified war effort. The sight of nearly 7,000 ships on the horizon had not just signaled the start of an invasion. It had been a proclamation of a new world order, one in which victory was determined not by the warrior's spirit, but by the engineer's slide rule and the factory worker's shift. The German officers understood this with a chilling clarity. They had watched as their world was taken apart, piece by piece, by a force so vast and so powerful that it seemed to obey different laws of reality. The unstoppable fleet Walter Olmsson saw that morning was the beginning of the end, a tide of steel that would not stop until it had swept all the way to Berlin. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments. The story of the men who fought in Normandy is a powerful reminder of the profound human cost of conflict and the immense forces that shape our world. For more meticulously researched stories from the past, be sure to subscribe to our channel and join our community of history enthusiasts.